Hello everyone. Today we are going to be painting with paper. I don't know if you've ever done that before or even ever heard of doing that before, but you can actually paint using tissue paper. So we're going to use tissue paper. Depending on what class you are in, you're going to be using certain colors. I'm going to use my example with all the colors. So you might not be using all these colors. It depends on what class you're in. Every class in the school is going to be making one of these, and we're going to save this paper that we make and use it for another project later in the year. So the first thing that you need to do is write your name on the back of your paper before you start, because it's going to get really, really wet with water. So all we're going to use is tissue paper, little squares of tissue paper, and water and a paintbrush. That's it. That's all we need. You're going to take your water with your paintbrush. You're going to use a softer paintbrush because you're just going to be using it to put water on your paper. And you're going to get one area of your paper wet to begin. Don't do the whole paper at once because it'll dry fast. And the reason why you need the water is to make the tissue paper stick down. So once you get your area wet, you're going to start putting the tissue paper on. And you can put on your paper so that it overlaps. And you can start to see how it starts to soak up the water. You want it to overlap other pieces, but you want to make sure you put them on one piece at a time. You can't just grab a bunch and sprinkle them on. You have to do it one piece at a time. Some of them stick together, so you might have to kind of rub them apart. If you notice, see how it's starting to get dry already right here in my corner? So if that starts to happen before you finish putting your paper on, you can get your brush a drink of water and then just gently and lightly tap it while the brush is wet with water. You're not painting across, okay? Because if you try to paint across your tissue paper, it's going to pick it up with the brush and rub it and make it a big mess. So you don't want to do that. You want to just gently tap, and then you can add more paper. Don't make a bunch of layers though. Overlapping so that one or two are over top of each other, that's plenty. You don't want to overlap 10 or 20 pieces of tissue paper. And you can start to see by adding the water, it's starting to pull the color out of the tissue paper onto your paper underneath. Now once these are dry, the tissue paper will fall off. Right now it's stuck to your paper because it's got the water there. But once it dries, the tissue paper will just be back to normal, back to being dry tissue paper. It'll look tie-dyed, which is pretty cool. And we're gonna save that as well. But the paper underneath will look completely different. It'll have pulled the color off of the tissue paper. And you can see when you overlap darker colors, like my red over my blue, it makes another color between, which red and blue would make purple. So depending on what colors you're using, some classes are using just green, some classes are using just blue and purple, some classes are using a mix with all the colors. Depending on what colors you have, when you overlap them, they're going to blend. It's kind of like watercolor paint in paper form. So it's just a different way to make a background. And we're kind of tie-dyeing our paper this way so that we can use the paper for another project later in the year. I'm trying to go fast. When you do yours, I would like you to take your time. But as you can see in my example, I'm trying to make sure that any little areas of white paper that are peeking through, I cover them with tissue paper. It's okay if they hang off the edge, like up here I've got some hanging off the edge. That's not going to matter. You just want to get all of that paper, your white paper, covered. And you also want to make sure that you give your brush enough water as you move around your paper and as you add more pieces of tissue paper, that you are having enough water, because if they're too dry, Like if I was to try to stick some down here where I painted water earlier, they're not going to, a little bit of them get wet, but most of the piece is dry, right? This is still dry. So you need to make sure that you check and you have them wet enough. Otherwise, the technique of the tissue paper absorbing the color into the paper underneath that we're trying to go for, that's not going to work as well. And you can see how it pulls the color from other areas. And you want to leave that alone. Once you have them wet enough, once you have your tissue paper wet enough, where these ones up here have been really soaked, you don't want to add any more water. Too much water is not good either. You kind of have to find that balance. And you're just going to move from where you started. I started up here and I kind of moved this way. And you can see some really cool things happening. And this paper, once it dries and falls off, you'll see some really cool pieces that have a lot of different vein colors that come into them from the other pieces that are around them. And the paper underneath is going to look extremely different, but it's going to be very, very tie-dyed looking, and that's kind of what we're going for. And this is going to be our background paper once it's completely finished. It'll be the background paper to another project. I think you can get the hang of it by looking at what I've got here. Once you have them on, you want to leave them on. Don't take them off. Now, my fingers aren't too bad, but I've done this project before and had gotten my fingers completely dyed, especially the darker colors. If that happens to you, it's going to take a few washes, a few hand washes to get the color to come off, but I promise you won't be stained for the rest of your life. It'll come off eventually. You might just have to wash your hands a few times today. Now, because these are going to be super wet, like there's a lot of water that I've put on here, so you're going to have to carefully, and you might even need help from your teacher that's in today with you, to carry them to the drying rack. Because they're going to be so flimsy also, because they've got so much water on them, you might, I kind of suggested in the plans that I left for the teacher today that we pile these on top of one another. And that's okay to do because it's just water and paper, so they're not going to stick together. So if you pile them on top of one another as you put them on the drying rack, like 4 or 5 on top of the same piece of paper or the same level on the drying rack, that'll be okay because they'll dry and then they'll come apart once they're completely dry. It's just water. So the reason why I suggested that was also because so many different classes are going to do this project, we need to make sure there's enough room on the drying rack. And I would kind of like them to stay on the drying rack until I come back so that I can save the pieces of tissue paper. Once they're dry, they're really easy to blow around and fall off. So I don't want that to happen before I have a chance to get them all in a container and save them, because those are going to be used also later in the year for another project. So we're kind of planning ahead here by doing our background paper today with the tissue paper and painting with tissue paper, and then saving the paper that we make that we're putting on top for another project, and then using the background paper underneath for yet another project. So I cannot wait until I'm back in school and I can see what kind of tie-dyed blending colors that you were able to get by overlapping your tissue paper pieces and only using water to make a background paper and some tissue paper colors that kind of have all these different veins of color that go through them. I hope you enjoy this lesson, and I can't wait to see you all soon. Bye!